Rosewood Gorge is unforgiving, even on a clear day, but when the monsoon hits, it turns into a death trap. Karan had been pushing his bullock cart for hours, his muscles burning as every step sank deeper into the endless mud. The rain fell with physical force, battering his face and chilling him to the bone. Hypothermia and absolute exhaustion were closing in fast. Surviving the night in the open was rapidly becoming a mathematical impossibility. Then a sound pierced through the howling wind and crashing thunder. A temple bell. It was clear, rhythmic, and impossibly calm against the violence of the storm. He pointed his exhausted animals toward that ringing, desperate for salvation. In reality, stepping off the main path to chase an out-of-place sensory cue meant Karan was leaving a natural disaster behind and walking directly into a perfectly laid trap. Pushing through the dense tree line, Karan stumbled into an ancient, decaying Shiva temple. The storm's roar immediately muffled, replaced by the heavy scent of sandalwood and the soft glow of a single oil lamp. Stepping out from the shadows was Baba Agor, dressed in simple saffron robes with a thick white beard and ash smeared across his forehead. The old ascetic radiated an intense, unnerving calm. The Baba offered Karan shelter and fresh fruit, but followed it with a strict, absolute condition. Once midnight arrived, under no circumstances could Karan step a single foot outside the temple walls. He locked eyes with the young traveler and delivered a chilling warning. Out here in the gorge, the darkness plays tricks. If you hear someone calling your name tonight, do not answer. They are no longer among the living. Escaping the downpour solved the immediate threat of the storm, but it placed Karan under the jurisdiction of a much older set of laws. Deep into the night, as Karan drifted toward sleep, a sound bled through the relentless rain. It was a voice, soft, desperate, and unmistakably familiar. It was his mother, begging him to come outside and help her. The entity remained outside because of a hard physical constraint. The central node here represents the traveler inside the temple. Protected by a boundary the entity is incapable of breaching. Its direct attacks simply bounce off the exterior. To bypass this barrier, the entity searches for a different point of entry. It effectively scans the victim's mind, looking for the person they love most to find a crack in their resolve. Once that connection is identified, the entity recreates the sound of that person's voice. It shapes its own cries into a flawless mimicry of Karan's mother, projecting the sound across the threshold and directly into his ears. The trap doesn't require the entity to force its way inside. Instead, it relies on the victim to unlatch the door himself, using his love for his family as the key. Outside the temple, the illusion intensified. The soft pleas warped into terrified sobs. The voice claimed she was freezing, that she was in excruciating pain, and that if her brave son didn't open the door, she wouldn't survive the night.
Rational thought collapsed under the weight of sheer panic. Karan convinced himself she was actually out there in the mud. He rose, walked slowly toward the darkness, and reached for the latch. Before his fingers could even brush the timber, a hand clamped onto his shoulder like a vice. Baba Agor violently yanked Karan backward, throwing him violently to the hard stone floor. The old ascetic didn't bother explaining. He immediately dropped into a lotus position in front of the Shiva lingam and began roaring ancient mantras, using the volume of the chant to drown out the mimicry. The moment the chant filled the room, the illusion broke. The comforting voice of his mother twisted violently, ripping apart into a furious, guttural shriek that rattled the very stones of the temple. Karan survived the night, but it required no physical struggle. He was saved only by the sudden, jarring rupture of an emotional illusion. When the first light of dawn finally hit the temple floor, the oppressive silence returned. The rain had completely stopped, but the physical evidence of the night's siege remained etched into the earth. Circling the entire base of the stone temple was a dense track of deep, chaotic footprints. They looked almost claw-like, overlapping in a frenzied pacing that abruptly stopped exactly at the invisible perimeter of the temple sanctuary. Baba Agor stared at the mud, and finally explained the haunting of Blackwood Gorge. The footprints belonged to the spirit of a woman who had lost her husband decades ago, descending into an absolute isolating grief. Unable to cope with the reality of her loss, she wandered into the forest during a severe storm and took her own life. That tragic end bound her consciousness to the gorge, trapping her in a perpetual loop of sorrow. Because she cannot escape her loneliness, she actively hunts for company. She mimics the voices of those the travelers love most, desperately trying to drag them into the same dark isolation she suffers. In this forest, the haunting is a loop of human sorrow. It is the tragic remainder of a woman who couldn't find peace, turning her own grief into a trap for anyone who passes through. Karan packed up his cart and fled the forest the moment the sun cleared the canopy. Hours later, he pulled into his village courtyard and froze. Standing right there, bathed in bright sunlight and completely unharmed, was his mother. He ran toward her, wrapping his arms around her as tears finally spilled down his face. The adrenaline evaporated, leaving him to process how close he had come to stepping out into the dark. In Blackwood Gorge, the predator ignored Karan's physical presence to focus entirely on his heart. It found the person he loved most and used that bond as a hook. Surviving a true psychological siege means understanding that sometimes you have to fortify your own mind and guard yourself against the deceptions buried in your own empathy.